Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking all things resilience with Dr. Elizabeth King. Elizabeth, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thank you for having me, Dan. I'm very excited to talk to you.
Before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a leadership development expert, I say, but really passionate. My life's work's been about how to improve the world with better leadership. And I started in the corporate world in healthcare and did a MBA and a coaching master's and a PhD in mindfulness, all to end up talking and investigating about how we can make better decisions in life. And the ramification of better decisions is enormous in the corporate world and the sport world. And sport is a fantastic microcosm of the rest of life. But we can study it in a controlled way. And what goes in is often very easily displayed on what comes out. So I'm excited to do that.
Why leadership? When did you start to get passionate about leadership? What was the catalyst there?
Oh, wow, right. So I'm in the pharmaceutical industry, senior role in a global organisation running their prescription division, which was sold just before Christmas. And I had many, many people I cared about that I needed to share that they needed to go home with their families and say next year would be different. But over Christmas, the merger failed. And that meant that these people had to then be back on track, launching a new product in migraine. And I'm like, how do we do this? How do you continue to perform when you're personally stressed, when everything's changing? And how do we minimize the damage that has on individuals and organizations? So that led me to my fascination with leadership and the complexity around it and the emotional balance around it and the incredible importance of it. And all we have to do is look at what happened over COVID to know how massively important leadership is and look at the state of the planet and we get humbled by it. Yeah. So leaders need help. It's a complex situation to study. There we go.
Well, corporate sporting landscapes are complicated, aren't they? And people are complex systems. So I actually get that complication, that complexity. Interestingly, you talked about, or you mentioned emotional balance. Did I hear you correctly that you did a PhD in mindfulness?
I did a PhD on leadership in uncertainty, which absolutely
Okay.
built from that story that I told you about. Yeah. So I'm here going like, how do I lead these people in uncertainty? But at the time, I'd been running my own consulting business. It's brought together two disciplines: the discipline of coaching, which is self-change, and the discipline of mind-body medicine, which I studied at Harvard, which is like performance, really, right? So you can see it as self-care, or you can see it as performance, like a way to get to flow.
Yeah.
So if we define flow as a high state of performance, and then we define coaching as a way to get you into a high state of performance, I integrated those two disciplines. And in that integration, there was a whole suite of skills that I taught. But the one that I found really compelling to people was mindfulness. And I wanted to investigate it. Was it just my experience? Was it just this mindfulness revolution that was coming, on the back of John Kabat-Zinn starting mindfulness-based stress reduction and the essentially Buddhists bringing mindfulness, like Western Buddhists bringing mindfulness into the world in an instrumentalized way? I wanted to investigate it. And what I did find in my own practice was it was really powerful because it's so pragmatic. But was it better than any other good thing? Was it better than going for a swim? Was it better than training hard? Was it better than breathing whilst running, right? So that's when I did a PhD on the potential solution of mindfulness to developing leaders in uncertainty, leaders to perform in uncertainty. And I found a whole lot of stuff, Dan. Firstly, there's no one mindfulness. It's very difficult to study, and most of the research is problematic.
Funnily enough, I've just seen a paper on that. It recently came out a couple of months ago. At least it's a 2023 paper that critiques mindfulness.
It's recent.
A little bit around, because there's that, and to speak to your point, that lack of definition and the varying types of mindfulness. It's challenging to to measure effectively and to, I suppose, measure its efficacy.
Absolutely. We need to embrace the complexity. So in my own work, I map it. And what you find is often people will take the only measurements we have are psychological measurements, but they're measurements of individual instrumentalized mindfulness, and they all work really well. And that's a really good place to start. But what we can't do is then correlate that to, in this instance, how mindfulness can be used for a team dynamic, because then it's relational, it's impacted by the complexity of the environment. So it's just about being really careful about, does the context match the
Mm.
label, right? In most mindfulness studies, the contents does not match the label. That doesn't mean it's to throw it out, but it does mean we have to be careful about the claims. And also to note that there's far more available than the instrumental, individualized version of mindfulness that is sucking raisins. So my own word is it the raisin or the reason? Is mindfulness about the purpose, or is mindfulness about just presence? But that's not what we're here to talk about. So I will stop ranting.
No, 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 no. I think it's fascinating stuff, and I would imagine mindfulness is a potential intervention for the kind of thing that we're about to speak about.
Well, in fact, Dan, this paper is actually the benchmark before the mindfulness study. That's what this was about. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this study that we're going to speak about, I got very excited. I think I'm trying to think back because we've been speaking for some time now about you coming on, and I'm pretty sure I saw it on a Twitter link, and thought, "Oh, this sounds awesome! I really need to get Elizabeth onto the show." This is the Sports Psych show, so it does have a sporting element, despite your corporate background, and the two work synonymously. I don't think anybody's doing
Mm.
cartwheels in an office and trying to do gymnastics routines, but there's so much crossover between sport and the corporate world around performance psychology. But this paper, navigating team resilience, a video observation of an elite yacht racing crew. And important to mention that you had some co-authors here, Layla Branicki, Kate Norbury, and Richard Badham, but you headed up this research paper. So, team resilience and exploring this in an observational way, observing elite yacht racing crew. We're going to unpack this. So, tell us a little bit about the genesis of this. How come yachting, Elizabeth?
So the thesis here is
Mm,
that I was looking to find a comparison to a senior leadership team, potentially a board.
okay.
So what often happens in the study of top management is that sport is a really powerful comparison because it's far more controlled, right? But the metaphor of sailing and business is pervasive and so useful. You know, the common term in business is VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the ocean provides a beautiful metaphor for it. So if you look at decision making processes in the ocean, we can absolutely make correlations to what can occur in business. So that was the genesis of it. And what I wanted to do was learn how second generation mindfulness, and second generation mindfulness is a Buddhist derived mindfulness, which simply means it's got a wisdom framework and an ethical framework on it, as well as the more instrumental presence focus of first generation mindfulness. I wanted to see whether these ideas would have an impact in senior management. But to study it, the sailing crew was a beautiful research site. So this was the benchmark study. How does this team work, right? What makes the team work? Because they're a very functional team generally. There's a very successful team. The navigator is one of the most successful navigators in Australia, and that's most successful in terms of one of the most difficult ocean races in the world, right? So we know that this is a functional team.
Okay.
So studying this functional team as a benchmark and then injecting a mindfulness training which has a business frame and then studying what happens afterwards was the long-term goal, which is what we've done. Hiccups. But this became fascinating in itself
Mm,
for what didn't happen. It became fascinating because of the correlations to people that do other sorts of extreme teamwork whether it's rescuing people from dangerous places, whether it's first
Mm.
responders or whether it's other extreme sports. It became a great study on what I found really paradoxical, which was how people who are trained to perform under pressure can potentially not do so well when when the pressure's off. And I've since discovered that there's many disciplines where this is actually quite a common situation. That calm can be one of the most poignant versions of adversity for a team trained to perform in crisis.
That's really interesting. So actually, when the pressure is off,
Yeah.
that's that's when teamwork can atrophy, can fail.
When the pressure is off, the mind can ruminate. When the
Mm.
pressure is off, it is about the way we prepare, anticipate, as opposed to defend. So, as we see in this paper, we've unpacked it as resilience as a process, and the process has elements of defense and anticipation. And the defense is can be quite well done under crisis. It's the anticipation that actually keeps a team going. And when the crisis is off, if it's something that still is an adversity, but it doesn't require that sort of adrenaline approach, that's when the mind comes into play. It's when the mind skills are really important. Now, sailors generally don't do mind skills training. I know football teams do. I don't know what other sorts of teams do, but sailors generally don't do mind skills training.
Sailors generally don't do mind skills
Don't.
training. That's what they told you. That's the kind of information you acquired from them.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but that was my understanding. They don't
Okay.
generally do that. So I know that this team, before I worked with them, had not done mind skills training.
So this team hadn't done anything. Just taking a step back, this paper is about resilience. It's about navigating
Yeah.
team resilience. How are you? We've had quite a few episodes on the Sports Psych Show speaking about resilience, individual resilience, team resilience, organizational resilience. How are you defining resilience in this paper?
Yeah, so there's a whole wealth of literature around how one defines
Yeah,
resilience, right? So what and this is not to say this they're all great. Like they're all great. This is a generative conversation. We need more and
of
more
course.
discussions of resilience. There's no agreed definition of
Okay.
it, right? But the view we took here was a set of processes that unfold over time. And in particular, those processes, this is where we landed, the
Hmm.
processes involved anticipation, coping, and learning. So, what it is, it's like a meta capability that involves these defensive coping strategies and offensive, where we anticipate and adapt. And these processes support teams to work independently and return to or beyond the pre adversity level. And that's different to some of the other sort of definitions of adversity, but that's where we landed. And the reason we landed on process is because team resilience is different to individual and organizational resilience in that there's this complexity of interdependence between the individual and the system to which they exist, right? So there's a massive complexity in teams, and they're so important. They're the basic function of any organisation, and they're the function in a sports achievement.
I love this, and correct me if I'm hearing you incorrectly. Resilience is a meta capability, so it's sort of an inward capability, if you like, and to analyze your internal. And what I'm hearing you say is it the process is, I'm going to use the word challenge here, is anticipating the challenge, coping with the challenge, and learning through the challenge. Would that kind of be
Yes.
there or thereabouts?
Yep. That's how we chose to define it, and that's how we chose to look at it because we took this process view, and that's what's important about this study is that we recorded by video and audio this crew over these 3 days and 2 nights. So what we get to see is how it unfolds over time. It's not a snapshot. So that means we get to see the interaction and the flow and the development of resilience.
I like your definition because it feels very pragmatic and sports likes practical, as you can imagine. I mean, it feels very practical for me
Yes.
as a consulting sports psychologist to step into an organization and say, hey, look, why don't we see resilience as being process driven, and it's about, let's talk about helping your people, your participants, your competitors anticipate the challenge, cope with the challenge, learn with and through the challenge. I mean, that's great.
Mm.
That makes sense, right?
It does, and one of the motivations for this is that we can imagine teams generally have to respond to external adversity, something that happens external to the team, right? And the
Mm.
complexity is that that external challenge can create an internal challenge with the interpersonal dynamics. So often teams are managing the external challenge at the same time as they're managing the internal challenge. And what we see in many teams is that they could manage an external challenge together quite well. But if you add an internal challenge, it becomes more difficult.
Well, and brilliant, because I was going to ask you about this, because I mean, stealing from your paper here, teams often need the capacity to manage both external and internal team adversity simultaneously, suggesting a need,
That's it.
yeah, suggesting a need for team resilience research to encompass both sources of stresses, which are frequently interrelated, which makes it tough and challenging, right? And so subsequently, are these the questions you were posing in this research paper, external, internal team adversity? I mean, what were the specific questions you're posing here?
The questions were, it was inductive. So the questions were looking at this team to see if we could develop some sort of theory of team resilience from looking at the data. And that's what we
Okay.
did. So we developed this idea about the internal versus external adversity. That's how we came about it. And what we observed was this idea that comes from theory but hadn't been really investigated in team resilience to any significant extent yet. And that was that relationship quality was absolutely crucial to the what we observed as team resilience. And then when we unpack the theory, we could unpack what relationship quality meant. And that meant things like the ability to carry emotionally, emotion carry capacity. And that's about how well people can express both negative and positive emotions. And what we see in this study was the ability for this navigator, this absolutely deeply respected man, to express extreme negative emotion and to be held by his crew. And in the holding from the crew, the performance could continue. But without that, it couldn't have. We see that the relationship quality includes connectivity, which is like how close people seem to be, how much they trust each other. And importantly, this idea of tensility, which is the capacity for relationships to withstand strain. And we can see how this is relevant not just to sport, but everywhere. How tensile are our relationships? And this team went through a really difficult moment when their leader essentially was disabled, but they had such strength. And the strength came from trust. And this is what we can learn from sailing crews, I believe, in sport, is that no one gets on that boat unless everybody agrees. Now, if we had every team had that, I don't know how broadly that type of uh, philosophy is applied in sport, but it absolutely. I mean, when you're on a ocean race and it's life and death potentially,
Mm.
everybody's got to trust everybody. So no one gets on the boat without that. Therefore, there is this really strong docility, which you observe in the video by actually how often people are talking to each other. Like there's this banter that goes on. And the banter seems to be an indication of the trust and connection.
That's really interesting, and what I'd like to do, because I really want to unpack how you measured what you measured. You mentioned video there, and obviously that's in the title. So I want to speak to that and really help the audience picture what it is you specifically did, and then we can unpack what you found probably go a little bit deeper into what you've said there. I do want to just take a quick step back because I'm mindful that we started to speak about external and internal team adversity. So please excuse me. I'm going to take a
Mm.
slight step back there. Um, what do you mean by external and internal team adversity? Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, that's important. Thank you. That was one of the big debates we had with actually our editors to try and make sure we were clear about it.
Hmm.
So external adversity is the environment.
Okay.
Now, the easier way to imagine that when you're doing an ocean race would be a really dramatic storm. So in the Hobart last year, there was such a dramatic storm that this same crew lost a rudder and they couldn't complete the race. They were stuck. And there was a previous race in the Hobart where, 40 boats retired. The idea is that it's weather, something outside. So in this instance, it was actually a cloud which stopped the boat altogether next to a competitor who had high winds. Right. Internal adversity is the interpersonal dynamic. So what we get here is a very distressed navigator who's got this really powerful negative emotion going on with a lot of bleep words, and to the point where he will openly admit he was on suicide watch. Now, as one steps out and goes, this is about a cloud above the boat, we're just stopping the boat. But his response was so dramatic and so extreme, and to this day, he's distressed about it. Right? That's internal team adversity, because what it meant for the team was for quite a while they were confused. They weren't anticipating, they weren't preparing. So when you're in this type of sport, this long multi-day sport, when you can't actually do anything to keep sailing, you need to be preparing. You need to be getting things ready for when you can do something. But they weren't. At this point, they were disabled because their navigator was disabled. Yet there was a kindness and a caring and emotional carrying that meant that as soon as the navigator recovered, the team had recovered. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it does. I'm just going to reflect back what I heard. That external, that environmental source of adversity, in this case, a cloud, uh, heavily influenced the navigator,
Yes.
and that places a stress on the internal source
Places a stress on the
of
relationships because he was,
on the relationship.
yeah,
Yeah,
well, yeah. So there's a stress because the navigator's not functioning. So you've got the lead,
yeah,
you've got the strategist out of the game for a while.
and so as a heavy mediator of a team's ability to pull through in that moment is the quality of the relationship,
That's it.
the connection, the trust,
The trust.
the
That's it.
tensility. Okay, all right. So again, taking this step by step, because you've introduced us to a few of the findings that you've had, but again, coming back and taking this step by step, how did you measure behavior, communication? How did you measure what you
Yeah.
wanted to measure?
So this is what's unusual about this study, and the idea behind it is that often research is let's ask people questions, let's interview them, let's talk about how they perceive the situation, and we did do interviews, but we wanted to see what happened. We wanted to see what happens under
Mm,
pressure, so we used video. So there was two cameras on the boat for the entire time. One was on the upper deck, so you could see what was happening when people were sailing, and one was down below where you could see what was happening when they were navigating. Right now, the conversation is recorded downstairs. You can't hear it up
okay,
on the deck, but you can see
okay,
what people are doing. Right. So one of our researchers is an expert in film,
okay.
and she's an expert in observing behaviour. So together we watched the film and we created our own ideas, and then we shared our ideas, and out of that themes were developed. So it was an inductive research as opposed to the opposite where you just ask some questions and draw conclusions from that.
So I think it would be enormously challenging of me to say, well, what are all the things that you saw and you heard? But when you were, when you think about what you wrote about in this research paper and you think about the conversations you had with your fellow researchers? I mean, what were the main? You've spoken to a little bit of this already, but what were the main things that came through, essentially from the audio and the video? What did you see? What did you hear?
Yeah. Deep caring. Absolute deep caring.
What do you mean by that? Can you unpack that a bit for me?
So there's like the crew didn't know what in the moment. Like we're only talking about the crisis, right? But this is a whole multi-day race where people are, you know, concentrating at the beginning of the start when it's
Yep.
really intense. That's the state of flow that people need to be in. It's actually external adversity, right? But in that case,
Hmm.
the crew was harmonious. They would be doing what they have at other times described. We changed the music and we changed the dance. They were harmoniously working together under adversity at the start, which is a very dangerous part of a sailing race, right?
Okay.
Then there's smooth sailing when everyone's preparing properly, noticing everything that's going on, that incredible level of vigilance that sailors need. And all through this time, if people don't know, there's like a 4 hours on, 2 hours off, 4 hours on, 2 hours off, which is okay until you get to day three and you're actually exhausted, right? So what you see is people's really innate ability to be kind and caring for each other come out as everybody gets tired and mistakes get made, right? Now, in this moment of difficulty, when the navigators lost the plot, they sort of fumble around for a while, don't really get a bit paralyzed, and then they start to make each other tea, start to make a drink, start to just have a few little jokes, look after each other to enable him to have the time to recover, to enable him to recover and determine the strategy once again, to stop swearing, to stop seeing the disaster and just deal with it. So sailors often talk about the need to accept what's happening now, and that's what we all need to learn. We need to accept quickly what's happening now. And on a sailing boat, if you don't accept quickly, you can't strategize and you can't perform. You've got to get back on track, like in all sports. You've got to get back on track once you get off. But what, to me, the key outcome was the importance of relationship quality in team performance and in team resilience. So much comes down to relationship quality.
And at the heart of that relationship quality is caring for each other, do you think? Did you find?
I think it's trust. I think it's trust. And it's an acceptance, this idea of emotional carrying where there is so much trust that you can absolutely express negative and positive emotion. And that is a capacity that I wish we could have in teams in all walks of life. There is nobody silenced when you can actually express negativity and be heard, and it's okay. And there's a lot of positive expression as well. There's a lot of gentleness.
So that combination of trust and caring can potentially lead to,
Yeah.
or can lead to an acceptance of individual differences within adversity. That
Yep.
we accept that in this case the navigator, the leader, is in a bad place, but we trust that if we do the right thing here, then this person will, if we care for this person and we do the right things, that this person will pull around, this person will start to function effectively again.
Yeah. And this person has proven time and time again that he will do that, and they have deep respect and trust for him. So it's not an issue. It's not an issue. It's just like, yeah, it's like your children, right? It's like, of course, your child's upset. You hold your child until they're better, and you know they'll be good. I don't know if that's an appropriate
Mm.
metaphor, but it is emotionally. It's that level of care and trust for people that is on that boat in the middle of the night in a difficult situation when you're exhausted and cold and really unhappy.
I don't want to step too far away from this paper, but yourself, as your experiences in leadership and your studies, and with relation to what you observed from these sailors, trust and caring. How is that? How do you feel that that is developed, or how do you feel it was developed within this crew? So a sort of a generic question and a specific question within it.
Mm. I actually really love this question. But it may not be like a politically like correct type answer, right? So there's actually like there's a lack of socializing. There's a lack of spending time doing things that aren't task focused. What there is training, and there's a shared goal, and everybody has like different goals within this. So some people do Hobarts, like this wasn't the Hobart race, but some people do Hobarts to have a sort of like a retreat break, right? I go like, really? You're going to go on a boat, a small boat for, 3 days to sleep for 2 hours at a time, and that's a retreat. But it is, it's like a retreat for them. Some people want to do it just because there's a number of Hobarts they want in their life. Some people want to do it because it's just a sense of achievement. All different goals, but when they're together, they've got one goal, and that's to win. There's no doubt about the fact that this team is together to win, and they train to win, and they're on that boat to win, and that's it. That brings them together. So they don't spend a lot of time socially. They will maybe work on the boat, etc. But they're a little bit like a board and a little bit less like a general management team, in that they come together irregularly and to make important decisions. And that builds this tensility in this case.
I think that's really, really interesting. And this is something that's come up on the Sports Soak show quite a few times now. I mean, for me, in my mind, as a sports psych practitioner, I go to the sort of literature on, I'm going to be a bit binary here, but task versus social cohesion.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. The first thing you said there is actually there's not there's a lack of socializing,
Mm.
that it's not necessarily, hey, we're going to go rock climbing together to build this social cohesion so we get along, or we're going to go
Yeah.
canoeing in preparation for this so we all get along, and or perhaps we go out and have beers and stuff, and that may have been part of the process, but it sounds to me that you're actually orienting more towards they're building shared mental models
Mm.
and task cohesion by doing a lot of training together and having a shared goal. That
That's
doing a
it.
lot of training together is going to build shared mental models, and having that shared goal builds task cohesion. It's those two that feel like they're out front. That's not to suggest that social cohesion isn't important, but trust and caring can and often do come from training a lot together and having that shared objective.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. That if there's a social event, it's as a result of getting to the end of the task. At Hobart, everybody goes out for a drink, of course. They need to eat. They haven't eaten
Mm,
properly, in a warm space for 3 days. But that's not what they do. They get together, they prepare the boat, and they sail. They sail together and
mm.
they race. And the race is really important. And in that, they build really strong relationships. And they help each other and they support each other and they trust each other with their lives. So there's a level of psychological safety that's extreme. That's so extreme because they're trusting each other with their lives.
And so, may I ask then, from your observation, audio, visual, you talk about strong relationships. I think most human beings, as a hypothesis, when you say that, they major orientate towards liking each other. A strong relationship requires a liking. But
Mm.
are you suggesting that in this instance, that there may not have been a liking for each other? There may have been, but that might have been just incidental, that they didn't set out to like each other, but there was that, again, training a lot, shared goal. That, when you say strong relationship, that's the bedrock of the relationship, not necessarily we're mates.
Um, yeah, it's not we're mates. However, no one gets on the boat if they're not liked.
Okay.
But it's not leading with liking, because you won't get on the boat if you're liked, but you're not trusted
Yeah.
to sail.
But the trust is more important than the liking.
If you have to make, I think they both come, but yeah, yeah. Which one leads? What did we lead with? Yeah.
Mm.
I didn't investigate whether trust was more important than liking, but if you imagine yourself on a boat in a potentially life-threatening 3 or 4 days where your life could be threatened at any time, you're really going to trust the people you're on that boat with.
You want to know you're alongside competence.
That's it. You don't get on the boat without that.
So somebody could be great crack down the pub. You can
Absolutely.
have a beer with,
Yep.
but if he doesn't know his port from his starboard,
And there's a wisdom in that, because there's another thing about caring for people, and you're going to care about someone so much you're going to make sure they're not at risk, so they're not going to get on the boat.
yeah, yeah, that absolutely makes sense.
It's not published. I went into looking at how dangerous ocean racing was, and it's dangerous. It's difficult to find stats on it, but the injuries are quite extreme when they occur.
Yeah, no, I can only but imagine. Was there anything else there from the data that you observed that was interesting? And again, potentially recalling from the conversations you mentioned. I mean, absolutely fascinating. You had a fellow researcher who's an expert in behaviour, uh, probably interpersonal behaviours. Was there anything else that shone through there? You've spoken to this period, this time when there was a literal cloud, not just a metaphorical cloud, but a literal cloud that influenced navigators' behaviors. So that sounds really, really interesting. And this trust and caring came to the fore, and the strong relationship came to the fore. Were there other times relationships came to the fore?
Yeah, I think, to me, the key message from this paper is that there's a 2 by 2 in the paper that describes different forms of adversities and the way that we might respond to them. So
Okay.
there's a 2 by 2 where we're talking about the degree of team adversity experienced and the
Hmm.
degree of environmental adversity experienced, and the way these things can come together. And we were using the metaphor of the race and the storm, but what we see is if there's high degrees of team adversity yet low degrees of external adversity,
Mm.
that's when we create chaos in the calm. That's what happened on the boat in the cloud. The cloud was a external adversity, yet there was internal adversity as well, right? So they created chaos despite the fact that there was calm. Now, if
Mm.
you've got low external adversity and low team adversity, they can be like smooth sailing. Everything's going okay, and that's important to prepare for next time. Yeah. Now, when there's high external adversity but low internal team adversity, that can be calm in the chaos, and that's a high state of performance and the sort of flow that we often talk about. Yeah. The
Mm.
Mihaly state of flow that all athletes are trying to get into, and we want them there, right? That's perfect. These guys do really well, and we saw that at the start of this race. It's described in there. And then there's this idea of the perfect storm, which in this case was the perfect lack of wind, where you've got external adversity and internal adversity, and that's when a team is dysfunctional. So the idea in this paper here is to just unpack that there's different types of adversity. There's chronic, there's long term, but in this case, there's this combination of internal and external adversity. And what we want for a team, many highly functioning teams can perform under external adversity, but where they fall down is if you combine that with internal adversity, which leads us to the idea of ensuring that we work on our relationships to sustain team performance under what is this incredible escalation of change and disruption in our world. And the escalation of change and disruption in our world that plays out in all sorts of ways, the military, business, frontline workers, can be studied in sport. So we can see how sports people can deal with these external adversities and how their training can then be understood in terms of decision making processes and then applied in other situations for the greater good of all.
It's interesting because a couple of months ago, I spoke to a researcher called Bernadette Kellerman on the Sports Psych show, and she introduced us to something called the multi-action plan, which talks about performance states, so mental states within performance. And in very simple terms, in very crude terms, two positive states to be in order to compete, if you like, whatever that competitive arena is a flow state. Might be your number one state that you've spoken about quite a bit today, and that's why I'm speaking to this. But then also a second state to potentially compete in that might be necessary is more of, if flow is effortless, that second state might be effortful, where maybe adversity is hitting you, and that might be external and it might be internal. It might be internal, a whole bunch of, and I'm talking intrapersonally here, a whole bunch of thoughts and feelings and emotions are hitting you because maybe it's a tight game, it's a tight match, and you've got to work really hard on yourself with your self-talk or with your body language or whatever it might be, with the attentional cues, and you've got to work really hard. You've got to be really effortful in that moment to be able to push through. Whereas other times it's effortless and it's almost like peaceful, and you're just doing it, and time slows down, and you feel you've got much more time to make decisions, and so on and so forth. And I'm saying this because there feels an element of these in what you observe, that during the race there's a flow state, but then if there's good relationships, then in that effortful state you can help each other push through tough times, such as when there's a storm, when there's the cloud, and so on and so forth. And no question there, but just Elizabeth, just a thought back at you.
Yeah, oh, look, I love this whole idea of flow because my own research is on mindfulness, and I
Mm,
think that there's a downside to flow. The downside to flow is you're performing within a narrow focus,
mm,
right? So when you've got a team, and particularly sailing is a great metaphor for this, is you need awareness as well as attention. So flow is essentially a state of focused attention.
mm.
Then when we expand to mindfulness, it's the broad awareness as well. So when you're
Okay.
in an ocean race in high speed, you need the combination of focused attention and broad awareness so that you know what's going on. And in another study later that we'll talk about maybe next year, there's an incident where the skipper, who has his hands on the wheel, knew after training exactly how long he could focus whilst maintaining awareness of the wind, and then when he had to stop, because it is effortful. Absolutely, it is effortful. Yeah. So the problem we have with flow, I think, is in a team dynamic, sometimes it can keep us too narrowly focused on either the task at hand or our own performance, as opposed to the dynamic and the relationship. So I don't know if it's a football team, but certainly if it's on a sailing boat, we have to simultaneously be aware of everybody going on. And when it comes to emotion, it's being aware of our own emotion, being aware of the way we impact others and the way they're impacting us. So there's this need for awareness. That's my speak. I don't know if I'm just jamming with you on flow.
No, I love it, and because I have a real interest in all of this. My experience at the coalface has always been really everything that you've spoken to there. That as a practitioner, I want my clients, the people I'm blessed to work with, to do the things that gives them the best opportunity to find whatever their flow state is. Okay, and that tends to be synonymous with the Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi literature. Such a wonderful name, isn't it?
I know, I
Uh,
can't. I always get nervous to say it.
well, I've heard it in different forms, but I think I'm more or less in the ballpark. And obviously he passed away a couple of years ago now, and what a wonderful legacy he left. Equally at the coalface, my experience and the experience I know of a lot of my colleagues is there's a little bit more to it, because the competitive landscape can tend to be quite complex, and there tends to be ebbs and flows environmentally and internally as well. And so subsequently helping athletes, competitors, participants prepare for effort as well, prepare for adversity, that anticipation that you speak of, that almost feels like a different state, whereby there has to be a shift there, and it can be uncomfortable. It's not this effortless, comfortable feeling of quick decisions, don't have to think about it. And it's an interesting dynamic, Elizabeth, because when you speak to athletes and you ask them, so much a tool in the toolbox is, well, tell me about you at your best. Tell me about when it goes right. And they'll talk about not thinking at all and just doing it. And that's all very nice, but often they do have to think and they do have to scan their environment all the time and do that
Yes.
effortfully, you know.
So,
And you've spoken
yeah.
to the fact that the sailors have to do that as well. And, you know, what you spoke about with the attentional shifts, it reminds me of Robert Nidifer's work, you know, from the late 70s, early 80s, around broad and wide, broad and narrow, external,
Mm,
internal flexing, you know, and that's important. Can that happen in a flow state? Does that happen naturally, or do I have to
yeah.
force that? And so does that take me out of a flow state? Questions.
Well, yeah. I mean that can so this is the magic of mindfulness, and it's difficult because people have all sorts of reactions and up, including nausea around the word, right? But if we just go to the elements, the elements are attention. Oh, from my own work, I mean, other people's work have different words for the same elements, though, right? But the mind skills of mindfulness are attention, awareness, and acceptance. Now, that is a magic potion when it comes to sports performance because
Yep.
you're focusing on the task at hand, simultaneously broadening your awareness and developing the capacity to rapidly accept. Now, that's all great, and lots of people train that, but I don't believe that you get anywhere near the power that you can of that unless you add this framework which enables it, which is around kindness, balance, equanimity, compassion. These things that um, the
Okay.
wisdom fields tell us, because they enable us to have this rapid acceptance. They enable us to focus. So understanding that everything's uncertain, everything's independent, everything's changing, and that we need to respond to others with kindness and balance and equanimity allows us to focus on our mind. That's my point on it.
I love it, and it makes it suitably complex.
Suitably complex, but when it comes down to the what really happens, so one of the skippers says, after talking with my coaching, he says he takes out the lesson that when you're making yourself a cup of tea, make someone else one. So this is what happens on night two after very little sleep. Don't just make yourself a tea, make someone else. And they actually explicitly discuss kindness and patience. And these things create a banter and a sense of trust in the team,
Mm-hmm.
which I think allow you to accept and focus.
So that's interesting. So on the one hand, it's a sailing group who haven't done any overt mental training, but in many respects have done it implicitly.
Oh, sorry. So that story was after they'd been trained.
Oh, after, right, okay, there you go.
Sorry,
Yeah.
but that was just jamming to your point about what is performance, what is flow.
No, but I
Yeah,
love the fact we've just highlighted the importance of mental training, which is gets to the heart of this.
that's what happened. Well, this is where so we went from this paper, which is creating chaos in calm, to an exquisite performance post mind training, which was a life-threatening incident where it was a very dangerous, life-threatening incident, and they performed brilliantly and won the race, and there was no damage to asset or human. And they all suggest it was the mind training, their ability to stay focused in a difficult situation,
What a wonderful advert for psychological intervention.
without a doubt. And you know what? Like, there was a much more grounding incident this year after more training where there was no win, but what there was a saving, a smashed asset, a lost rudder, 4 days on the ocean without support, and no life lost.
Wow.
So I was deeply happy that we'd had that training, and it's like the other side. One side's the winning that we all want, and the other side is just be safe. Everybody's home, everybody's safe, and there was no tension after an incredibly difficult many days in the ocean without support or a rudderless. We call it
Rudderless.
rudderless.
And so to finish our conversation today, although this is the Sports Site show, I'm mindful of your experiences in the boardroom and in a corporate environment. What do you feel? What are the takeaways for you, for leaders, for people in those kind of environments? And I think coaches listening in will be able to associate themselves with these kind of takeaways, because ultimately that's that's what you're looking at as well. Sport, relationship between sport and
Mm.
corporate stuff. So, what what are the lessons from this research for the corporate?
You know, they're so parallel, right?
Mm,
Boardrooms need to anticipate and minimize risk externally and
mm,
internally. And, one of the challenges we have is that our identity gets in the way, right? So, what you see on a boat is you've got this strong personality of a navigator, and sometimes there's a silencing of the crew. They might not want to suggest that they notice something, right? That's on steroids in a
mm,
senior management team. We need to encourage people to be able to speak up. We need that psychological safety that you see on the boat in the boardroom, right? And that's about really
mm,
not silencing people and therefore being aware of our own strong attachment to our identity, our own strong attachment to our opinion, being aware of how we come across to people so that others can speak up, right? That's on the boat, that's it. We need to cope and improvise, which creates a radical acceptance of reality. We see that, yeah, we see that. So there's no cloud, there's no wind, deal with it. There's 40 knots, deal with it. Right? There's no movement there, like seconds. Now, in a boardroom or in a senior management team, there's often a major decision to be made. And yes, maybe there's papers, but often there's not. Often it's the similar thing. There's less than adequate information, which we see in this cloud situation. The whole reason it happened was that the information was faulty at that point. Now, we see that in senior management teams all the time. We have to make best decisions. And the answer there is wisdom. The answer is we make decisions based on the greater good with the information we have at the moment, right? So it's an absolute clear framework on the greater good for everybody. And that's what happens on the boat, of course. Even though we want to win, everybody's safety is number one. And I think it's just an absolute reminder to us all of the importance of relationship quality in every aspect of our life.
mm,
um, and that comes from allowing people to express negative and positive emotion and providing psychological safety, and performance is a result of psychological safety and positive engagement. Now, Barbara Fredrickson and all that work on, broaden and build, and even though they might be debate the debata, whether it's, 5 positives to 1 negative or 7 to 1, and there's a whole big debate about it. Our lived experience is that a relationship is better when there's more positive feedback than negative, and when we focus deliberately on what works rather than focusing deliberately on what doesn't, because that's the natural state of the mind under stress. And I think we need to take that proactive approach to prophylactic emotional medicine of positive focus on what works about people, of positively looking at the value people contribute to a team. Sorry, that's a bit of a rant.
no, well said. Love it. Love it. Fantastic, Elizabeth. This has been absolutely fascinating. What a really interesting research project and line of research that obviously you're following. I can't thank you enough for your time today. How can people get hold of this research? I know it's open access, so I assume that's just a Google search. But how can people get hold of this research paper? How can people find you if you wish to be found? How could they follow you? Are you on social media?
I'm on LinkedIn and my website is drelizabethking.au, and I will put the paper on my website. Give me 24 hours. But you can also just Google navigating team resilience, King et al., and you'll get it.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, Elizabeth, I can't thank you enough for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Lovely to talk to you. And thanks for bringing to the attention of the coaches in the world and other interested people this idea of team resilience being a process that we can all benefit from.
I think it's a great way to look at it. So thank you so much. Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that, and I'd love to hear what you think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.